Good morning. This is lesson 5 in our Sunday school series of Proverbs. And lesson 5 really talks about a blueprint. My career as a real estate agent, I always would shudder when someone would call me and say, Jim, we built this house ourselves, a piece at a time. We just designed it ourselves and built this house ourselves. And I would shudder. I said, did you use plans? He said, oh no, we just made it our own. Well, a house built without a blueprint, without a major plan, is a mess. They're hard to sell and they only usually fit those people who built it. But God gave us a blueprint as Christians for every situation we find ourselves in. If you've been in our class long, you know that there are 4 fundamental authorities or structures God gives us a blueprint for. The first one is our individual priesthood. When we get saved and the Spirit takes up in our heart and soul, there's a blueprint in how we're to live our lives individually from then on. Right below that is the family. God gives us a blueprint for successful families. Now, the successful family is a unit that fits in 2 other authorities. One is the government and the other one is the church. If that family is flawed, it's like having a brick in your foundation that's not trustworthy. What we're seeing today in our society, in our churches, is a breakdown of the family blueprint affecting the effectiveness of government and church. If that family unit is not strong and following the blueprint God designed for the family, then it can't function effectively in church or it cannot function effectively in government. I'm not saying that there isn't a place for single people, but if you don't follow the blueprint for how you to live your life singly and corporately in a family, all other structures will fall apart. That's obvious. The biggest problem with crime in inner cities is the breakdown of the family, not racism, not police brutality, and I'm sure there's some of that contributes to it. But the major contributing factor, we're told time and time again from people who study it, is the breakdown of the family. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. Solomon stressing to his son the importance to follow and protect the blueprint of the family. And that's what he's talking about today. Because it will indeed stretch those other entities. And we're in Proverbs chapter 5, and let's begin reading in verse 1. My son, attend unto wisdom, and how thine and bow thy ear to my understanding, that thou mayest regard discretion, and thy lips may keep knowledge. Now, the word discretion is real simple. It means good decision making. Sometimes people say, well, that may have been correct, but you didn't exhibit a lot of discretion in making that decision. You didn't do wise in that decision. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong. It wasn't the best decision. And so that's what he's talking about here in the first 3 verses. In verse 3, for the lips of a strange woman drop as honeycomb, in her mouth is smoother than oil. A strange woman. Now, when you look that up in concordances and you find it, it's someone that is not part of that entity. A strange woman in the priesthood of the believer is the flesh. It's what entices you to go against the God's blueprint. The strange woman in the family is another woman or another man, something that's outside that threatens the integrity of that marriage. The strange woman in church, as spoken in Revelations, is the harlot of false doctrine. A strange woman in government is that element of government that does not recognize God as the authority of all governments. It's a lawlessness even at the governmental level, because God established government in the Noahic covenant for really one purpose, and that's law and order, so that people in their depraved state wouldn't destroy each other. So understand that there's a harlot in each of those 4 entities that God ordained. And the key thing is watch for them and beware of them. Today, Solomon is going to focus on the family. But understand, this strange woman or this harlot exists to destruct all four of those entities. But let's move forward. For the lips of a strange woman is a honeycomb. Now you have to understand, back then they didn't have a lot of sugar and sweets and etc. Honey itself was just an intoxicating sweetness. I mean, it was something that was just foreign to their love. Now I obviously have a sweet tooth. I love sweet things. I have a hard time passing up a bakery or a donut shop or anything sweet because I love it. And it does have its effects on your health, detrimental as they may be, but it is enticing. All sweets. Back then, the honeycomb was the ultimate sweetness. And a strange woman is referred to as that honeycomb. And oil, olive oil at that time was precious and it was very enticing, but it also was very slick. And it was an oil. An oiled surface would cause you to slide. You wasn't going to fight or hold on to or resist olive oil. It's made and put in there to knock down all the resistance of everything and to slide and to slip. So a strange woman is the sweetness of honey and the irresistibleness of oil to holding on. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. And verse 4 kind of nails it. It's always bad. Let me tell you something. I'm 72 years old. I've been a Christian most of my life. I've observed a lot of people who thought they had to have a strange woman. But I can tell you, marriages destruct usually from one of two reasons. Either one person is so abusive they drive the partner away, or there's an outside party, a strange man or a strange woman that entices one of the people out of the marriage. Now, I've seen people who are driven out of a marriage by an abusive husband or an unfaithful wife who are innocent people survive that marriage and have a relatively happy life in either another marriage or another situation. But I'm going to tell you something, and I'm sure there may be, but I have never seen a person who was enticed out of a marriage by a strange woman, a male or female, have a successful, beautiful, God-blessed marriage. It ends in bitterness. I can name situation after situation after situation that it's happened. And it's just not there. They always find them out. Bitter in that. Let's read on in verse 5. Her feet go down to hell, and her steps take hold of death. Death and hell. This is the end that the strange woman that's destroying the entity, the family, is going toward. A lot of times they don't even know it, but that's the destruction that takes place. It is so obvious when it follows down into hell. You know, I thought about that in a recent current events. There was a young man that Henry taught in the 4th grade, and she liked him. And as a matter of fact, they lived a couple streets over from us when we lived in North Charleston. And that young man didn't have the best home life, but he came up and married, moved away, went in the military, had a successful marriage, and had a good friend and his wife, and they would get together. And eventually, the wife of the visiting family enticed him out of his marriage. And those two, man and woman, broke up both those marriages and created their own. You may have heard about it on the news because that woman eventually enticed his child that was living with them into the car and murdered him. A young boy, a precious young boy. And she murdered him, then escaped and came back to South Carolina. You may have seen that. But when I read this, that's what I thought. That enticing, strange woman in that state of depravity that would destroy a marriage, entice this young man out. Now, he has his responsibilities, but her evilness, going down to death and hell, couldn't have been better represented than what she did to that young, innocent boy. It's such a tragedy, but that's what you're dealing with. And this word, Proverbs, foretold that and foretells it day in and day out. I could name friends that I've had, acquaintances I've had, people I've worked with. I remember I had a person that worked for me that was a leader in our company, and him and this other woman who worked in our company came together. They were both married, just to different people. Sat down in my chair, wanted to meet with me, and said, "Jim, we fell in love." I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Oh yeah, we fell in love, and we just want to make sure that you were aware of it and that things would be okay." I said, "Well, they're not okay, and neither one of you have a job here anymore, particularly the manager." They looked at me like, "Yeah, but we're in love." "No, you're not. You violated a trust. And if you destroy the marriage, the wickedness and the evilness of that will eventually go over to something else." They were surprised. It ended up blowing up, as they most 90% of them always do. One of the marriages survived. I don't know if the other one did. But I've seen it happen. I've seen a person I had tremendous respect for, a very powerful, influential person that was respected in the community, had great honor. And as a young lady that came along that was very talented, and he took a personal interest in that young lady and wanted her and helped her career along, and she became very successful at a very young age, and before you know it, they were intimately involved, destroyed both marriages, young children involved. Later on, they were involved in excessive drug abuse, and it just destroyed their honor, integrity, lives. People can come back from that, but I want to tell you something. You're going to end up going down that same path. I have a friend right now, a person that some of you may know, that's being enticed by a strange woman and has left his wife and children, young boys who need him more than ever at this time, left them to satisfy that lust. And this was a respected, successful businessman in our area that I thought the world of. But when you see that, it just destroys it. It destroys it. You want to take them to Proverbs 5 and say, read this. Read this before you're here. Read verse 1, 2, 3, and 4 before you get into verse 7. God has a blueprint. You violate the blueprint, he also has consequences. They're outlined here. And I see them played out time and time and time again of good people that did not heed truth and knowledge and did not use discernment and made good decisions while there was still time. And therefore, he goes on. In verse 7 through 11, he says, take the long view in mind. And this is important. Before the actual adultery takes place, mistakes are made. As David was on that roof and he looked, he should have turned around and went below, but he didn't. He looked and he stayed looking and he lusted and he called for her. If you go up on a roof and you see something that stirs your stomach, run. In verse 6 it says, lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life, her ways are movable. What does that mean? She has no principles. Now when it uses she, but there are men that entice women and women entice men. So the strange woman is unisex. It can be either one. But one thing's for sure, if they'll destroy a godly marriage or attempt to destroy it, they're evil, wicked people without principle. And when you get with them, you still are with an evil, wicked person without principle. I don't care how pretty they are, how nice they sound, or how religious they are. If they destroy a family, They're evil and wicked, and God's destruction will follow. Verse 7, hear me now, therefore, O children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way from her, and come not nigh the door of her house. What does verse 8 mean? He says, don't even get close. Don't walk by the door. What that speaks of is preventive maintenance. Don't go near it at all. As soon as there's an enticement, leave. Leave. That's so important. You have to leave. I call that preemptive striking, preemptive maintenance, things that you have to do. Because understand something right now. There's a term I want you to become familiar with. It's called intimacy adultery. Intimacy adultery is not when you have the physical acts. It's well before that. It's when you get close to someone of the opposite sex that's not your husband and wife. Don't do it. Don't do it. You say, well, gee, we're just friends. We have so much in common. We just love to talk together. Stop it. Those across the fence conversations with the opposite sex who are not your husband and wife will lead to something else. What he says, remove thy way far from her and come not nigh the door of her house, that's what it means. That's what it means. When I was at my prior church, I was a real estate manager, and I used to interview real estate agents, and 90% of the real estate agents are women. And someone went to my pastor and said, I've seen Jim Reese out, and he's having lunch with women that aren't his wife. Then the pastor asked me about him, and I told him that's what I did. I didn't get mad at those people. Let me tell you something. They're looking out for me. And I needed to look out for myself. I remember I would never, if someone come in and they wanted to talk intimacy, I would shun that away. You need to speak to someone in your church. Let me refer you to somebody. Let me tell you something. I don't want to be a personal counselor to some woman that's not my wife. It doesn't mean I'll give some advice. It doesn't mean we can sit down as families and talk things out, but I'm not going to provide personal counsel for someone of the opposite sex. I've told you before, my wife and I have this real standing order early on in our marriage. It says, if you ever feel uncomfortable with the relationship I have with someone else, or that you have with someone else of the opposite sex, I don't care how innocent it is, as soon as you say, this don't sound quite right, stop it. If you say, I don't feel comfortable with that, the other partner terminates it. Whether there's anything there or not, terminates it. That's probably one of the best things you could ever do in your marriage. Always to give the other person the veto on any relationship you have. Why? For the cause of your marriage. It's that simple. Do not fall. Before there's physical adultery, there's intimacy adultery. That's where the boss talks to this young lady that's just trying to help him out. And before you know it, they go to lunch. And before you know it, she's telling him or he's telling her about their marriage problems. You're on the way. You have not used discernment. You are on the first stages of adultery, whether you go to bed then or not. Understand that. That is absolutely true. Verse 9 through 11. Leave not thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel. You'll lose your honor. Let me tell you something. A man or a woman who is enticed out by another person out of the marriage and leaves them, their honor is gone. Their dignity is sold. Lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger. That talks about financial ruin. And let me tell you something, that usually follows. And quite frankly, I'd pray for it. What? You don't pray for all? No. I pray God would chastise a man or a woman who's in the act of destroying their marriage while they still can. If they can repent from it and turn, if it costs them their wealth or whatever. Because I'm going to tell you, it doesn't stop with your wealth. Let's read on. And thou mourn at the last when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. That has two meanings, really. It means later in your life, You always come to your senses. Many times it's too late. And I've talked to many friends that I've had that went through it, and later on they said, Jim, if I had it to do all over again, I'd have just stayed there because I have regrets that I'll die with. It also talks about your health. God, let me tell you something, Christian. God disciplines and chastens those people he loves that destroy their blueprint or his blueprint for their lives. He will not put up with it. That's critical. Let's move on. Down to verse 15. Drink waters out of thine own cistern. Now here's the solution. Let me tell you what the solution is. You want to avoid this? You're happily married. I don't care what age you are. You want to avoid it? Drink your own water. You know, it's really funny that he'd use water. Drink thy water out of thine own cisterns, and running waters out of thy own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers watered in the streets. It's silly. Let them be only thine own, and not thy strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let me tell you something. A marriage that is pure is like water that is pure. And in these days and times where this was written, water was the most precious thing you had. And pure water was extremely precious. And you would collect rainwater in cisterns, and you would cover the top and protect it. And you drank your own water, because who knows what was in the water in the other wells. Because I'm going to tell you something. Once you spoil the water, people don't trust you anymore. People ask me, they say, Jim, can a marriage that's been tainted survive? I say yes and no. What do you mean? God can restore a marriage to a certain point, but one of the consequences of a breach of faith is distrust. That marriage will never be like it always was. Never be. It can be restored. It has a scar on it, and it can be restored, but it will not be as it once was. I remember when I was in the Navy, I was a young sailor, and I went to my first submarine. And when you're brand new, you make coffee. Well, on a submarine, fresh water is precious. You don't have a lot of it. And I would make coffee, and I'd take that big coffee cup back, and we had a stern torpedo room, and back there, there was a head. There was a flushing head. And to conserve fresh water, I would rinse out the coffee ground thing down in that head. I'd just raise it up because it was flushing, and that salt water was what was used, and I would flush it out in there. I remember one of the crew members saw me flushing that out in there, and he said, "Whoa, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm flushing this out. I'm going to make water out of the fresh water." And he said, "Yeah, but you're using that screen in that commode." Let me tell you something, ever since then they say, "Hey, did Reese make that coffee?" They doubted the coffee. If I had made it, because I wasn't precious enough to keep it pure. And I know that may be an illustration that's funny or maybe even disgusting to some, but I think it's appropriate. Christian, understand this. If you have a good marriage, if you have a marriage that God has ordained, make it work. Make it work. Keep your water wells full. Protect it. Guard it. You know, we all want something new or different. Sometimes, you know, and I have mind lusts. They're usually come in the way of sheet metal or cars and trucks or boats until I couldn't afford them anymore. But change like that. But I want to tell you something. I've never wanted to go outside for a drink of pure, clear water. And a lot of that has to do with my wife always protected. My wife gets up in the morning and she prepares. She doesn't work anymore, but she doesn't come out in the house coat or not put her makeup on or whatever. She dresses and prepares herself, where I'll be the only person seeing her. And I'm going to tell you something, Christians. Protect your marriage. Honor that cistern. Keep it pure. Keep it desirable. Thank you very much. God bless you.